the serpent will bite without enchantment, and a babbler is no better. The words of a wise man's mouth are gracious, but the lips of a fool will swallow up himself. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is mischievous madness. A fool also is full of words. A man cannot tell what shall be, and what shall be after him. Who can tell him? The labor of the foolish wearieth every one of them, because he knoweth not how to go to the city. Woe to thee, O land, when thy king is a child, and thy princes eat in the morning. Blessed art thou, O land, when thy king is the son of nobles, and thy princes eat in due season for strength, and not for drunkenness. By much slothfulness the building decayeth, and through idleness of the hands the house droppeth through. A feast is made for laughter, and wine maketh merry, but money answereth all things. Curse not the king, no, not in thy fault. Curse not the rich in thy bedchamber, for a bird of the air shall carry the voice, and that which hath wings shall tell the matter. Almost sounds here kind of like the book of Proverbs, with some of the witty sayings that he puts together here. But again, kind of in the context, and he's been speaking of the vanity of life under the sun, the life in the flesh that we live here upon the earth. The material things, the things of this life, he says it's vain. Vanity and its vexation of spirit. He speaks about the inequities and the injustices of life and all these other things. And as he begins to bring it down here now, and he's contrasting, foolishness and wisdom, and he's given instruction, and again, kind of keeping in mind that this is spoken, as in Proverbs, as to his son, and to young people in particular, we will see here, is this wisdom being shared. Solomon is old. This is toward the end of his life. He realizes he's made some mistakes, and he is trying to pass on the wisdom and the knowledge he has gained to another generation. And so it's always good for us to learn. I love going to the Bible conferences and things, and you have the older preachers there. And those old enough to have been around and heard some of the older preachers of the generation before them. And it's always good because they pass down to us that wisdom and experience that they've had. And these things are important to us. And that's what Solomon is doing here. And so, beginning here with verse 11, he says, surely the serpent will bite without enchantment. You've seen the guy playing the little flute-like instrument and this serpent coming up, enchanters, and they enchant this. But he says a snake will bite without that because that's its nature. The snake doesn't need somebody to tell him to bite. And he says, and a babbler is no better. A fool doesn't need someone to make him a fool. You hear the old saying, well, so-and-so made a fool of me. No, they didn't. You did that all by yourself. That's what Solomon is saying here. The snake doesn't need anyone to make it bite, because that's its nature. And a fool is going to act foolishly because that's his nature. And so, when somebody does something foolish, they can't blame it on somebody else. They can't say, well, so-and-so made me do that. Flip Wilson popularized a line I don't know how many years ago that's been, but he said, the devil made me do it. No, the devil doesn't have to make you do it. You know, the Bible teaches us that when anyone is tempted, they're drawn away of their own lusts and enticed. Now, the enticement comes from without. He said, but it's their own lust that is drawn after that. We sin because we are sinners by nature. And we're sinners by choice. We see here, and especially as we look at what Solomon, some of the things he ties together here, one of his key thoughts always centers on those that are in authority. He's a king. He is someone in authority. He is passing on information to his son because he knows his son is going to be a king after him, or one of his sons will be, Rehoboam. And he had other sons, and they would, by virtue of their relation to him, be princes or have some important position. But that said, and we pointed this out before, we all find ourselves at some point in a position of authority or under authority to someone else. And so the things he's saying here, it's good for us to understand, and we can take the wisdom as just some good thoughts that we can apply to ourselves, no matter what our position or status in society may be. And so he relates this to all levels of authority, to kings and princes, to governors. We said before, you know, teachers, employers, husbands, parents, older siblings, anyone in a position of authority. And he goes on to talk here about the fool. So a fool is full of words. In verse 14. Continuing the thought of verse 10, the wisdom of this world is foolishness and is a dull or a blunt tool or instrument. As we go back to verse 10, he said, if the iron be blunt, and he doth not whet it or sharpen the edge, then must he put to more strength. But wisdom is profitable to direct or to prosper, to succeed, to do correctly. And so he's contrasting here foolishness and wisdom. And that wisdom is better than foolishness. And that especially is true in positions of leadership. So he talks about the fool. He's full of words. Even the wisdom of this world, God says, is foolishness. God has made foolish the wisdom of this world. And so many times we see in the scriptures the contrast, and it will talk about wisdom, but we need to be careful. There are those, we see it in Romans, I believe it is, the first chapter, verse 22, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. And we need to keep this in mind when we talk about wisdom, because the whole scope of what Solomon has been discussing in Ecclesiastes is that under the sun. And so a worldly wisdom, a wisdom derived from only what we can see and observe in the flesh, is foolishness. If it omits God, if it's not taking into consideration God and His intervention in things and so on, man's life is vain, and even his wisdom is foolishness, because what he's saying there in Romans, in professing themselves to be wise, And they have gotten to the point they said, we don't need God. And then there is no God. And through the scripture says, the fool has said in his heart, no God. And we see many today that are wise from a worldly perspective. They have education, they have degrees, they have studied, and yet they say no God. That's what he's talking about. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. The fool has said in his heart, no God. And so, just because something comes from someone who has a lot of education, a lot of degrees and titles, and so, doesn't necessarily make it true. They may be wise, but we need to distinguish between the wisdom of this world and the wisdom that comes from above. The wisdom that is by divine revelation. The things of God, are not discerned by the carnal mind, by the natural mind. These things are spiritually discerned. And so we need to also keep that in mind. And as he goes on, he describes the foolishness of a man's words, or the words of a fool will reveal him that he is a fool. And he said, the beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is mischievous madness. A fool also is full of words. And I think that's the idea about the babbler. And as we read some of this, I am reminded of people that I've come across. To hear them talk, they're an authority on everything. They know everything. But if you have to deal with them, you find out they're all talk and they don't really know what they're talking about. And that's kind of what he's describing here. He's full of words, but a man cannot tell what shall be. He says he's going to do something, he can do it. You say, okay. But you don't know for sure he's going to be able to do it or not. You don't know what the outcome is going to be. And there's a lot of people in this world that are like that. And so I think part of this is warning us to be able to detect and discern. Because one thing, if you're in a position of leadership, you want people around you that know what they're doing. No one person is an expert on everything. And so the great leaders, whether it be in national politics or in business or whatever, always surround themselves with good people. And so you don't want to surround yourself and have to depend on people that are fools like what he's describing here, because they'll let you down. And as he talked about that blunt iron, and then he says over here in verse 15, the labor of the foolish weareth every one of them. I mean, it'll wear you out and not accomplish anything. See, that's something else that is a result of the foolishness and talk. And they may put forth effort, and they may do a little of this, a little of that, so on, but it never comes together and never completes something. And so I think there's an admonition here and a warning about depending and putting our confidence in people that all talk and no substance. Because you cannot tell what the end of it is. The labor of the foolish wearieth every one of them, because he knoweth not how to go to the city. He doesn't really know what he's doing. And he'll weary himself and everybody else trying to do something. You know, somebody once made the statement about working hard or working smart. And then there's working foolishly is a third category, I think, that he is describing here. Woe to thee, O land, when thy king is a child and thy princes eat in the morning. So well, I thought we were supposed to eat in the morning, you know. I was raised breakfast was the main meal of the day. But you have to take it in context with what he follows up with. And two, by Jewish reckoning, when did the day start? The Jewish day began at 6 p.m. And so when you take that into consideration, and that's when people would party, that's when people, you know. He said, Blessed art thou, O land, when thy king is the son of nobles, and thy princes eat in due season for strength, and not for drunkenness. So the reference to them eating in the morning was they're partying. They're eating for the drunkenness or the gluttony of it. Whereas he speaks here, you're blessed when the princes eat in due season at the appropriate time. And they do it for strength. They eat so, you know, to be healthy, to be strong, because you need food to work and to keep going. And that's why they eat. They don't just eat for the sake of eating and for the pleasure of eating and for the drunkenness and so on. He says, by much slothfulness. Now he begins to carry this over, and he's pointing out this inappropriate behavior. The fool and the much speaking and the inability to get things done, the leadership and those that have truly noble character, and they eat in due season for the right reason, as opposed to those that want to just party, say, hey man, we're princes, we're kings, we can kind of do what we want, and they look at life as just as a party. And generally they party off the efforts and the work and the labor and the profit they've made off of other people. We talked about those he talked about, I believe, here earlier, those in their get-rich-quick schemes and things like that. And now he's beginning to also identify them that basically they're lazy. They're lazy. And this goes with the partying and the other stuff. By much slothfulness, the building decayeth, and through idleness of the hands, the house droppeth through. Why? I think the idea here and the image is they're so busy partying, and because they're typically lazy, they keep putting off the things that need to be done. The important things. You know, it talks about the nobles, they eat in due season for strength. And here he's talking about slothfulness and idleness. You know, you keep putting off and keep putting off the repair jobs that might be, you know, little, but it gets bigger and it gets bigger and it gets bigger, and pretty soon the whole building collapses because you didn't take care of those maintenance things that needed to be done. And that's what he's pointing out here. And then verse 19, a feast is made for laughter, and wine maketh merry, but money answereth all things. I thought, you know, that's kind of a odd thing to say. You know, especially, you know, from a biblical standpoint, as Christians, money answereth all things. But when you take it again, in the context of what he's talking about, who is it that has money? Who is it that has prospered? You know, he lays out in Scripture, those who work hard, that are diligent, that are not lazy, that are not slothful, they will prosper. They will succeed. The godly man, he's going to prosper. Abraham was a prosperous man. Why? Because he served God. That doesn't mean that everybody that serves God is rich and has a lot of money, but I think here he's using money, and I looked that word up, and it means the price or silver, and he said that answereth all things. Or that answers all things is in italics. But here we see a contrast made, because he's been talking about the parting in verse 16, and then contrast that with verse 17, verse 18, and 19, the slothfulness, the idleness, again the feasting, the laughing, the making merry. But I think the contrast is, though, just diligent, consistent, hard work is the answer. He over and over he has mentioned Chapter 5, verse 18, Behold that which I have seen, it is good and comely for one to eat and drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor that he taketh under the sun all the days of his life, which God giveth him. For it is his portion. And so I think he's kind of coming back to that thought here, that is our portion. We're to labor wisely. We're to be diligent and not slothful in our labor. And verse 15 is kind of the labor of the foolish wearieth every one of them. But the labor of the wise man is profitable. Then, as he begins to bring this to a close, verse 20. Curse not the king. No, not in thy thought. And curse not the rich in thy bedchamber. And so the king, those who are in authority, the rich, he says, curse not. That is, don't despise them. Don't belittle or think little worth or importance. A lot of times that is the attitude of people. And we are warned and admonished, curse not the king, for he's an authority. He is a higher power. And Romans 13 teaches us that we are to submit ourselves to the higher powers and to render to them that which is their due. And part of that is respect. Because there is no authority but that which God has given. So disrespect to those in authority is disrespect ultimately of God. We're to render their due, respect. And the rich, or the noble, he mentioned here. Blessed art thou, O land, when thy king is the son of nobles, and thy princes eat in due season. Those who by wisdom and hard, diligent labor have achieved their place in society. Notice, if you will, in 2 Peter. a lot of times we go to Romans and about the higher powers, but let's notice here too in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9. Well, let's back up just a little bit here. In verse 6 and 7, he talks about the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Verse 7, delivered just Lot, vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked, for that righteous man dwelling among them, in seeing and hearing, vexed his righteous soul from day to day with their unlawful deeds. Verse 9, the Lord knoweth how to deliver the godly out of temptations, and to reserve the unjust unto the day of judgment, to be punished. He says in verse 10, but chiefly them that walk after the flesh, in the lusts of uncleanness. And this goes back to the foolish that Solomon has been describing here in Ecclesiastes. They walk after the flesh. They're gratifying the flesh. And another characteristic of those who behave like that, he says here, and despise government. Presumptuous are they, self-willed. They're not afraid to speak evil of dignities. So Solomon is pointing out here, and Paul and Peter are backing this up and carrying this forward, is our attitude toward authorities, or those who are rich, those who are successful. We're not to be envious, and we're not to despise authorities, and we're not to speak evil of dignities. And he's describing those that do. And here again, here's something, when you hear somebody that is constantly bad-mouthing different ones in authority. And I know in politics, and we're coming into a political season, and there's a lot of stuff going on. And it's one thing to talk about policies and things like that, but we need to be careful how we talk about people, because when people constantly are speaking evil of police, and I know there's some police that exceed their authority. There are some that use that power, use that position and abuse it. And you find that in every walk of life. You know, you may find that in a manager at McDonald's. And you'll find that in the police department. And you'll find that, you know, because there's people that are like that in all walks of life. What he's telling us here is how to identify those people so that we can avoid them. Well, he said, you know, evil communications corrupt good manners. You hang around somebody like that, and you hear that all the time, you start thinking that way yourself. We need to be careful of the things that we listen to and the people that we hang around. And especially, we go back to the idea, if you, in your circle, you need to be careful of those people that you allow to influence you and counsel you, and that you depend on. I mean, you don't have to be a king to be in that situation. We all surround ourselves with friends and people that we depend on. And we need to be careful about those people and who they are. Who do we allow into that circle? And it's a warning to us too. What's your attitude? Curse not the king, no, not in thy thought. Curse not the rich in thy bedchamber. And we've talked here, he says, they despise dominion, speak evil of dignities. Jude 8. Likewise also, these filthy dreamers defile the flesh, despise dominion, and speak evil of dignities. Now, that person is corrupt. And he refers to them as filthy dreamers. Peter refers to them as the unjust. And here we see they're foolish and the foolishness of it. He says, for a bird of the air shall carry the voice, and that which hath wings shall tell them that. How many times, somebody says something, and you didn't think anybody knew about it. So, well, how did you hear about that? Well, a little bird told me. You ever heard that? Well, that's where it came from. A little bird told me. Of course, birds don't talk. But the idea is God knows the things that are done in secret. He even knows the thoughts and intents of the heart. And He will bring us into judgment, and we'll have to stand before Him and give an account to Him. You won't be giving an account to your best friend that thinks you can do no wrong. You won't give an account to your peers. This isn't trial by jury. This is a trial before the judge, the lawgiver. And He will hold us to account even for the thoughts and the intents of our heart. The things that we say to ourselves. The things we say when we're angry and we don't think anybody hears us. We say behind somebody's back. God hears it. He knows it. And so we need to train our thoughts and our attitude by, here's the wisdom, the admonition that's given to us by God. And not to be envious of people, not to despise people, to look down on other people, especially people in authority and positions and dignitaries and things like that. And realize God has put that person there for a reason. He's put that person in my life for a reason. We may not understand what it is, but we need to humble ourselves and accept God's will in these things. So some of the things we see here that He revealed, having revealed the vanity of our fleshly existence with its emptiness, injustice, and its ultimate futility, He says, lays the foundation for His summing things up. In the long run, wisdom is more profitable than foolishness. Diligence is more profitable than slothfulness. And I believe we see here that contentment and a submission to God's will is better than envy. And we need to guard our hearts and our thoughts and our attitudes. Because he brings forth here in the next chapter, he said, where is that? It's in chapter 11. In verse 9, talks about, rejoice, O young man, in thy youth. And he said, have your fun and everything, but remember this. He says that, know thou that for all these things God will bring thee into judgment. So we need to be careful and in developing our attitude toward life. And I believe that's kind of the scope of Ecclesiastes. God is giving us some guidelines and some wisdom here and a perspective on life that we can prepare our hearts. And what is our attitude toward life? What are our goals in life? And how, as we go through this life, how do we conduct ourselves? And how do we treat other people? This is a main concern. And so many times, our priorities, our goals in life are centered around things to gratify our own desires and goals in life. And anyone that we see that hinders that, anyone that has more than we do or we think hinders, we tend to attack them, belittle them, even if it's only in our minds. We envy the successful. We want the get-rich-quick schemes and things like that. And all these things he's pointing out here fail. So, how important it is for us that from the very outset we have that right perspective on life. We have, the right attitude toward life. We have a more realistic expectations of life. And that's what Ecclesiastes deals with in particular. What are your expectations of life? Careful, because many of the things that people look for and want and desire is vanity and vexation of spirit. That's all it's going to reap for you. Whereas contentment, diligent labor and contentment, and deriving the joy out of the fruit of our labors that God has given us is a more appropriate expectation. We will continue chapter 11 then, Lord willing, next Wednesday, and then chapter 12, and where he brings it all to a conclusion. And we will have finished up the book of Ecclesiastes. And then, Lord willing, because we started this on the poetical books. Actually, we jumped into the book of Psalms first, but without thinking we'd be doing all the poetical books. And then when we finished that, I was going to do, we're in the poetical books. And so we went back and did Job, and then Proverbs, and now Ecclesiastes. And so there's only one book remaining, and that's the book of the Song of Solomon. And so, Lord willing, we will get into that and study that after we conclude our study of the book of Ecclesiastes. But let us stand together then at this time.